Okay, today is day 2 of the bootcamp. Yesterday we talked about HTML introduction. Today we're gonna go a little bit deeper into HTML and talk about a very crucial feature called forms. You probably have filled a form online in one way or another, and that's a very important thing to learn because people use that all the time, and not only for like official documents, but in indirectly or informally, as for example, in you're on social media, Instagram or something, and you comment on somebody else's picture or video, that's actually submitting a form in HTML. There's like a text input, right? And you type the text and you press the button to submit usually. So we're gonna learn how to write those kind of things. So here's my environment. Again, I'm using Visual Studio Code, and I have my directory, full stack web dev 3 separated by a dash. And I have the source directory of all my HTML files. We have index and news.html so far. So we can right click this and reveal in File Explorer, and then you can right click that file and open up the browser or double click, and you should see the, let me show you here, share my browser. You should see the web page in the browser. One moment. This one. Okay, so I open that file by double clicking it in the Explorer or Finder if you're using Mac. And this is what the page looks like. You can also go from the browser and click File Open or type the URL here, the address path to that. Anyway, we have the 2 pages. You can read the news and then go back. So today, how about when you go to a website today, usually you have to log in or sign in, right? How about to build like kind of form? So let's go back to VS Code. And I'm going to create a new page. So to create a new page, we create a new file. Okay, so let's create the sign-in page. Typically, a sign-in page is just a text field for your email or phone or username, and then a password. That's the most traditional way, right? And a button to log in. Of course, today we have different ways of logging in, like email link. We have Google logins, social media logins. But let's keep it traditional and just go by the sign in with password. So right click source and create a new file here. Let's call it signin.html. Enter. Now, when we create a HTML file, we always have to follow the boilerplate. If you notice from the other files, let's right click this and open to the side so you can have some reference here. So you remember what I'm talking about. So if you don't remember as you're starting out this boilerplate, just look back at what we already have. That's a very powerful technique, not only into HTML, but in programming in general. Sometimes we forget the syntax. So what we do is we look back at what we did to remember, oh, okay, I wrote it this and that and that. And okay. So when we do the boilerplate, first thing, HTML at the top is the doc type to tell the browser we're using HTML version 5. So it's always like this, is less than sign and then exclamation, all caps doc type, space HTML, and then greater than sign. Use HTML version 5. And then after that, we define the HTML tag, and inside that, we have the head and the body. It's always like that. Now, we already learned HTML hypertext markup language. It's a markup language in the sense that we write tags, and those tags we have angle brackets that surround the element name. The angle bracket is just the character for less than and greater than. Okay. So to make a HTML tag, it's just less than HTML, greater than. But usually the tags, when you open the tag, you have to close it with another tag. That's the closing tag. So I always like to write it right away, otherwise I forget to do it later. So to close it, simple, just write it like you did for the opening tag, but put a slash right after the less than. So less than slash and then HTML, which has to be the same element name as the open tag. And then between that is when we write the stuff that's supposed to be contained within that element. Okay, so when I say contain or as inside an element, that means between the open tag and the closing tag as we read the code. Okay, now the code can be written like this in one line, like I said before. It doesn't matter, but for the purposes of us humans reading the code, it's better to visualize things if you add line breaks and if you add like a spacing after each open tag. This is called indentation. Okay, every time you open a tag, you add at least 2 spaces starting on the left. So that's why Visual Studio Code, if you press enter, it always adds that at least 2 spaces indentation. Now yours might be set up for 4 spaces or something. If you want to change that default, whenever you press enter in Visual Studio Code, you can go here at the bottom. You see spaces 2. You can click that and choose how you want to do indentation using spaces or tabs. I like using spaces and I like using 2. Other people like 4, and maybe they're traditional and they like 8, which is, I think it's overkill for the modern programming, but that's preference. Anyway, let's do the head tag, close the tag. Let's do the body tag, close the body tag. And then between them is what we type the stuff. Now the body is what people are gonna see. So we're gonna write the code to show the sign-in form. And then the head is metadata for this document page, which most of the time, the very basic one is using a title tag to define a title for this page. Let's call it sign in like this, close the title tag. So this is basically what you see in the tab title in the browser. Okay, going back to the body, we usually focus always on the body, and the other stuff we can ignore for now. We already have the boilerplate. So when we build forms in HTML, we have to create a container element, and that's called a form element. So you always want to have the form tag like this, and then don't forget to close it. And between them, it's the form itself, the form fields. So for a sign-in form, we're gonna have the email and the password and some button to submit. Okay, so let me see if I can annotate here. So we have the form, right? So the user interface, what we see, right, is usually input field, like a rectangle where we type some text, right? And then there's usually a label here, right, at the before or to the left. And then after that, there's another one for the password. And then finally, there's a button that says, okay, I want to log in. That's going to be your user interface. This is like my draft for what we're going to build. Okay. If you're interested in this aspect of design, it's design and user interface. Okay. That's UI. That's what people call it, the abbreviation. Anyway, enough of that. That's our wireframe. I'm gonna clear that and let's get to it. So how do I build? Let's first start with the text field. That's using the element called input. So make a tag, call it input. Now this is a special tag. Like I told you before, remember when we did an image tag? The image tag didn't need a corresponding closing tag because it is self-closing. The same way is for input. It's a self-closing tag, so you don't have to type input like this. It's not necessary, so you can just omit, okay? Now, if you have it just like this, you're gonna see a text field. Let's see the live preview. If you recall from yesterday, you can either open this page in the browser or you can have the live preview that's conveniently on the side of Visual Studio Code. So let me close this right-hand side panel, and I'm gonna do the live preview. To open it, before you, if you're new here, just to install it, just click extensions, look for live preview, enter, and install the one for Microsoft, click install. I already have it, that's why it says disable. Once you got that, I can go here, click the file that I want, back to the Explorer, that I want to preview. Let me just sign in. I have it open here. So I'm going to view all command palette, or you can press Control Shift P, and you should see this text box with a greater than sign. And make sure there's a greater than. Sometimes people delete it. You need the greater than. If you delete it, add it back, okay? And then you're going to look for live preview, show preview internal browser. That way you can have on the side the preview of this page. So every time I change my code, I don't have to be reloading my page every time. It automatically does that for me. Okay, so you can see there's a text box here and I can type hello. like that. Okay. I don't know what happened there. Just select all. So that's in the input. It's in its most basic form. You can type whatever text there. But if from the point of view of the user that is going to access your website, he doesn't know what the heck is going on. Okay, there's a text box. I can type something. What is that? What are they looking for? So this has got to be assigned in form. So we need to add a label to tell the user, hey, I want you to type the email, for example. So before the input, we add a label element. So we're going to do angle brackets label. And this one needs a corresponding closing tag. So you're going to add that as well. Now, between the tags is what the user is going to see. So let's say email there, and you see the text email appear. Okay. So that way the user knows, okay, this is a text field for the email. Great. Now, let's talk more about the input. This input thing is very versatile in the sense that you're going to see later on, it can take on many forms. So it can be just an input generic for any kind of text, or it can take on the form of being an email text field or a password text field. And those are more specialized because in the case of email, it will validate your format. If you recall, an email is always something at sign domain, right? .com or whatever. And for the password, usually we don't see the characters, right? They're usually bullet points or asterisks or something hidden. So that's why we can tell input to behave in a different way. And usually to tell an element to behave in a different way, we have to tell it some attributes, give it some attributes. Okay, so how do we add attributes? If you recall, remember we added attributes for the anchor tag with href, for image with source src, for the audio and video src. So go to the open tag. There's only one open tag and there's no closing, right? For the input, right-hand side of its name, add a space. And for this purpose, the name of the attribute is type. Okay, and then equal sign, double quotes, double quotes. Between the double quotes is what you're going to type for the value of the input. Yeah, but the default one is text. So that's the one that we already had. Now, if you want to make this email, just simply change that to type email. That way it will validate your typing an email. Now we cannot see it right away that's doing anything visually. It's the same thing, right? I can type whatever here. We only see the validation when we click the submit button that we'll add later. Once we do that, you'll see that it will complain, hey, this is not an email if you type it wrong. Okay, enough of that. Let's move on to another field. Let's add the password field. So the password is the same way. We can add first a label. So add a label there, password, close the label tag, just like that. And then let's add an input for the password. So input, and then add the attribute type. The value here is going to be password. And then close the opening tag. Now, if you go here for the second input and type hello, it's all bullet point. I can't see it. That's the difference between type text and type password, okay? And one funny thing, curious thing, maybe you might ask, I know some websites, there's a feature where I click to see the password. How does that work? Well, actually, what they do is they manipulate the document. They use JavaScript, which is the programming language that allows you to change your web page in real time. What they do is they simply go to this element using the code, and it changes the type to text when you click the button. So when you click the button to hide, it will actually do the reverse, will change type to password. So that's how they do that. Okay, you might have noticed our style kind of sucks. Everything is one line if I make it big width. And that's mostly because we don't have, we're working with just HTML right now. Usually when to change the style of a page, we use what's called CSS, cascading style sheets. We don't have it right now, but there's a way to make this a little better with just HTML. And the way we do that is we group every single label and input into a kind of generic containers that we call a div, okay? So if you take here, before the label for email, you add an open tag for div. That's the name of the container, okay? This is just a generic HTML element that can be used for whatever you want. It doesn't have any particular semantic meaning. It's just a generic container or box, okay? So I'm going to enclose the label and the input in this div. So meaning I have to have it between the open div tag and then the closing tag that I type right after the input. Remember, the closing tag has a slash. And then usually, for the sake of readability of the code, I always add to press tab here after selecting these two lines to add the indentation, which is the space on the left. You might notice every time I open tag, it adds 2 extra spaces for each open tag. And then when it goes back to closed, it goes back 1 level. And that gives us a sense of visual depth. And I understand, oh, this label is inside the div. This input is inside the div. Okay, it's just a trick we use to make a readability of the code easier for us to understand what's going on right away, although not necessary. And like I said before, when you say something is inside an element, that just means when the code is written, it's between the opening tag and the closing tag, okay? So this thing could be 1 line and it wouldn't matter, right? But just make sure it's between the open and close. You got to be careful with that. Many beginners probably they forget to add a closing tag, or they mismatch the tags and the document just becomes broken or something unexpected shows up. Okay, so be careful. Make sure there's always an aligning open and close. And Visual Studio Code or any other text editor usually has these vertical lines. You see them here. The vertical lines is a visual aid to let us know this opening tag has a corresponding closing tag here. So you can follow the vertical line to find the other corresponding. So if you don't have a corresponding tag or anything, it's probably broken and you won't see the line there pointing to the right thing. Anyway, enough of that. We always like to group these labeled inputs inside a generic container. So let's do the same for password. So if I do that and enclose with a div there, I have it nicely organized. Okay, I have the grouping for the email, the grouping for password. And like I told you, the benefit of doing that, at least in raw HTML, is that it pushes the next group to another line. And the reason for that, as we'll learn later, is because the div by default has the CSS property of display as a block. A display block, it doesn't allow anybody to be next to it. So the email container here with the div is saying, hey, I'm going to occupy this whole row and I don't want anybody next to me on the same line. So it pushes the password to the next one. And password in turn does the same thing because it's now under a div container. Makes sense? If you have questions, let me know in the chat. Hope this makes sense to you. Maybe it's too easy. How's everybody feeling? Have you learned this already? Or is it your first time? All right. Okay, let me teach you a nice trick here. I don't know if you ever noticed this in websites. If I go here and I click email, typically there's a feature that when I click email, it will focus the field here. The term that I use is when you click to type here, it's called focus, okay? Focus. And if I click email, nothing happens. I'm clicking the word email. I want something to happen, and that is I want to focus this automatically so I can type something. This is a nice feature that you can do, and I'll tell you the mechanism right now. So basically what you got to do is go to the input, and you have to give it an ID to attribute. ID stands for identifier. So to add an attribute, you can go to this one here that exists, outside the quotes, add a space. Oops. And ID, that's the name of the attribute, equals sign, double quotes, double quotes. Now, the ID has to be a unique value. I suggest you use lowercase. And if you need to have separate words separated with the dash. Please don't add space. Otherwise, you're going to think it's two different things. In general programming languages, you don't want to have space between stuff, okay? Don't add space for ID. Let me call it just email to make it simple. Maybe I'd like to add a sign-in form, dash form prefix to make it more unique and descriptive to what it means. Because it's a unique thing, there can be no other HTML element with the same ID. Okay, that's important. And you see that separate the words with a dash and all lowercase to keep it simple. Okay, so by giving the input an ID, we can identify it. Now I can go to the label tag, the open, and add an attribute called for. And the value for 4 will be the exact same ID of the input that you want to associate the label with. So I'm going to copy that, Control C, and paste it there, or you can type it out. So what that does is it associates the label with this input by its ID. So when I click the word email, it focuses that. So I can start typing there. See that? If I click outside, then click back, it focuses. So that's the mechanism here. Let's do the same for password. So basically, I want to be able to click password and focus to type. So go to the input for password, add an attribute ID. Let me add the prefix sign in dash form dash password. And then go to the label you want to associate with. Add the for attribute. Type the exact same ID or copy and paste. Sign in dash form dash password. Now let's test it out. Let me save this. I go here, click password, and it's focusing. Okay, it's important for you to get into the habit of always testing your changes out. Every time you make a change to your code, save the file, go back to what you had and test it out. Click something to see if it's behaving the way you expect, okay? Click password, that's correct. If you find it's not behaving the way you want, probably you made a mistake, there's a bug, and you got to go back and fix it until you get it right. So it's important to always get in the habit of testing. This is called testing, right? Okay, great. Now let's add a button to submit this. How do we add a button? Well, still under the form, make sure you're inside, right, between the open and closing tags. I'm going to do after this grouping for the password. We can add a button here. Now, there are two different ways typically people use for a submit button. The one way you can do is with the input element, and the other way is with the button element. If you do input element, you can do input like this, but remember, input is a text field, right? But it actually can take on many forms. So you can change the type with the attribute type to say it's input type submit. And now it becomes a submit button like that. You see that? Now, if you want to change the text, the label for the button, you have to add another attribute here called value. So add a space after this quotes, value equals, let's say, sign in. And you see that the label for the button changed. Now, if I click there, nothing's going to happen because we didn't hook up the form to anything. Okay, now the other way you're might come across as well is with the button. I didn't talk about button, but if you want to add any kind of generic button to the page, you can use the button element like this and make sure to close it. And the text for the button goes between the open and close tag. So, for example, hello world, that will show there. But I'm going to type sign in there. And this button here is the generic one. If you want that to be part of the form, you would say button type submit. Okay, that's a different way of having submit button. So you can use this one on line 16 or the other one, whichever you think is nicer. Okay. So I'm going to remove one of them, but for the sake of keeping a reference here for you, I'm going to keep this code, but make the computer or browser ignore this and not render the button. And we do that via what we call comments. Okay, so to make ignore code, you have to enclose it in this following syntax. So you have to type uh, less than, exclamation, dash, dash. And this is marks the beginning of a comment. So everything starting from that will be ignored by the browser as it renders. And then I want to ignore up until this point here. So I'm going to type dash dash greater than. You can see Visual Studio Code is so nice that it kind of highlights the code, all the tags and everything. And the comments are highlighted kind of greenish color. That's called syntax highlighting, okay? If you were to open this in Notepad or any other plain text editor, you're not going to see all these colors, okay? It's just an aid for us to better visualize the code. But you can see this is now a comment, right? Everything between these punctuation here is ignored. You're not going to see that. So if I change the sign in, whatever, 1, 2, 3, you still don't see the button, right? All we have is the button type submit from line 17. Okay, so I'm just doing that to teach you about comments and to leave a reference here for you that you know, okay, you can also type, make a button just for submission with an input element. Okay, let's add a H1 here at the top before the form. Let's say sign in. That's nicer. Okay, that's our sign in page. Now let's go back to index and actually link to this page. So if you want to refresh your memory, how do we link from index to this page? Now, if I go back to index, I can Control Shift P, live preview to show it on the side. And I want to be able to have a link at the top to go to sign in. So let's add after read the news here. I'm going to add a link. So anchor tag A, right? A. The attribute is href, and you have to give the name of the file, signin.html. And close the angle bracket. And let's type sign in, and then close the tag for A. And you can see sign in there. I know it's kind of messy. If you want to make it a new line right now, you can add a div to force it to take the whole row. It's a quick fix to put it in a new line. And yeah, it's there. So when you click sign in, it goes to the sign in page. If you're on sign in, if for some reason you want to put a link back to the home page, you can go there and add an anchor to the top. Maybe here, if you were an actual website, we usually have a header, right, of navigation. So maybe add an anchor href, index HTML, home, something like that. So when I click home, it goes back. Click sign in, it goes here. All good. Now let me show you that validation thing that I was talking about. Let's see if so when you have a form, you click submit, it has to go somewhere and submit the information. So the information you type in the form, it typically is sent as a request to a server, what we call a back-end server. Okay, there's a server that's always listening to requests. And when you submit the form, it goes to that server and says, hey, I want to submit this information. And the server would take a request and honor it if you are allowed to do so, right? You have authenticated and authorized to do it. And then it gives you back a response. Traditionally, it takes you back to another page saying success, whatever. In this case, a sign-in form, typically you click sign in, it does all the authentication, right? So you become authenticated to the system, and then it goes back to the home page or your dashboard or your profile, something like that. It's a redirection. Okay, otherwise it will tell you, hey, we cannot authenticate you. There was a problem authenticating, right? There's an error message that appears, something like that. And just out of curiosity, when you have sign in and authentication, you don't want to tell them your email, your password is wrong. because that will allow people who are malicious actors to figure out people's passwords by trial and error. So you want to be like discreet and not let the user know what exactly failed, right? Was it a password or the email or whatever? So you're always ambiguous. You want to say, oh, authentication failed, check your email or password, something must be wrong. Okay, you don't want to give out too much information in that case. But enough of that security tip. Okay, so let's submit this to a fake backend server. I got a fake one for you, so you can see what it looks like, submission. Let me see. So when we want to submit something, go to the open form tag. So you have to give two attributes, typically, traditionally, right? One is the method, and the other is the action. Now, the action attribute is the address or URL, form resource locator. And this is the one I'm going to use. I'm going to paste in the Zoom chat. It's just a fake one. It's not real, okay? And then the method, there's typically two methods, but when you submit a form, we usually use post. Always. Submit information is post. Now, to understand what is post, what is this stuff, you have to understand how the browser gets your web page. So let me try to show that right now. Here's the website. Like, go to the address bar, type some URL. That's what we call this, and enter. When you do that, you make a request to a server somewhere that will serve you the file, the HTML file, and any other stuff that it might need. Now, when you do that, the way you communicate with that other computer that's elsewhere is through a protocol, okay? It's called HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Okay, it's just a definition that's if I want to communicate, you gotta follow these rules, okay? And then within that specification, when you make a request, you have to let it know what kind of method or verb, and that could be get or post. Those are the two most popular ones. So for the purposes when you get an HTML page, right, you type in the browser, enter, that's a get request. Okay, a get request. Get request is typically used to obtain some information. So you're getting some web page back. So I want to get this specific address. And then you get it back, and then the browser receives the file like index.html, and it will interpret the file and then render the web page. If you're curious about that, you can always press F12 in the browser, and that should open the DevTools, developer tools. You can monitor the request by clicking Network tab and go and reload. So watch what happens. But before you do that, make sure your filters here are all instead of the other stuff. Click all. I'm using Firefox right now, so the UI is a little bit different from Chrome, but I was doing Chrome as well. But this is the same functionality. You see what happens when I click refresh, that reload button? It monitors that request. So you can read here, it's a method get, and the file was index.html. So you can click that row and get information about that request. Okay. So that's a method get. Now, going back to the form, let me also show Chrome because many people use Chrome, but it's the same. Let me see here. Same kind of thing. Go to the web page, F12, network tab. Close this thing, it's kind of annoying. Let's see. Close with that. And now you can see that. Click all. Refresh, and you can see the same thing, status 200. Click that. Click headers, and you should see here a request method get. Okay, so that's just telling you, if you don't remember any of this, just open DevTools. It always makes a get request when you access a website. Now that you understood HTTP GET, let's go back to that form. So this is the method. For forms, we don't use GET, And the reason we don't use get is because you're going to expose all the information in the URL of the request. I will demonstrate that to you. If I put get here, we should not do this. Okay, we should always use post. But let me show you what happens. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to go to the external browser because this environment here is not so great to do the DevTools. So I'm going to go back to the browser. Let's do Chrome. I'm here, F12. If you don't know about F12 key, you can always right-click, inspect. That also brings up the DevTools. And click network. And then we're going to go to the form, sign in, and I'm going to type something. But before I do that, let me see if the validation is working. Oh, there's no validation. Why? That's wrong. But anyway, let's look at this. You can see it make a request here, but I didn't type anything. So let me go back and type something at mail.com. Let me make this bigger for you. And I'll type secret password here. Click sign in. And you see, when I click this, where is that? Oh, I know what's going on. Sorry about that. I don't see any information here being submitted. And the reason is because the form fields are not annotated with what they mean. Okay, so I was expecting to see what I submitted here in the request URL. I don't see. Do you see this question mark? I'm supposed to see the email and password. And the reason for that is because we got to annotate the fields. So the backend server will know what kind of information each of the things are. So going back to the code, what we got to do is for every input, everything that the user is typing or selects a value, we have to make sure it has an attribute name. So for the email here, we have an input line 12. Make sure that has an attribute name. And you could give an arbitrary name. You want to be descriptive or like email. That seems good to me. Go to the password one, add the attribute name, and then call it password. Now, you might have noticed my VS Code is kind of like pushing the line to another line. That's because I'm using view word wrap option. If I don't have that, it looks like this, okay? So yeah, I have to scroll horizontally. I don't like scrolling horizontally, so that's why I use that feature, okay? So I click view word wrap. Anyway, make sure every single input in your form has a name attribute with a value so that the server backend, when they receive the information, they'll know, okay, whatever you type in this text field is for email. Whatever I type in the password field is for password. Okay? That's important. Let's go back to the browser, test it again. Remember, we changed the code. We always want to make sure to test. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to refresh because we changed the code. It has to load the new page. And then now that I'm here, let me see. Okay. Hello, mail.com, secret. I have the names, attributes for each input, so the backend should be able to understand that. Aha, do you see the network tab? You see the email there and the password. That's what I was expecting. Now that we have the names, they are usually encoded. So the attribute, the value for the name attribute appears like here, email equals sign, the value for that, hello %40 mail.com. And when you have multiple values, key value pairs, right? It's combines them with the ampersand and password equals secret. That's my password. You might have noticed this %40. That's because certain characters are encoded to other things because they're kind of special. So every time you submit the @ sign, you're going to see %40. Okay. And if you click payload here, this is very nice feature from the DevTools. It allows you to debug or investigate this submission of the form. And you can see the email was hello@mail.com, password was this. If you click view URL encoded, you can see that the @ becomes this %40. And when you decode, it goes back to @ And you click view source. This is actually how it looks like raw as it's sent to the server. It's just like this. Some name value, right? Name of the property, =, the value, and then if you have more, ampersand, another one, name equals, and then the value, and so on and so on. And this parsed is just a nice feature of the browser, so you can better parse that and see it like this, line by line. Okay, but you notice when I submit this to the browser, everybody can see my password. So that's the problem with making a GET request for form submission. That's why we don't do this. We don't want to expose the password in the URL of the request. Because if I look at this, you can see the header request URL. It includes the password. I don't want that there because usually the backend servers, whenever they receive a request, they will log. Log means record. We received a request from this person at the IP, whatever, for this URL. And they're doing that every time we request. Every service does that. So whatever people do on the internet is recorded. Like you make a request, records in some file, log file, that's what we call it. So we don't want to be submitting the form and logging out of user's password the personal information. That's why we don't do get for forms. Don't do get for forms. So let's go back and fix that. What we do is instead of method get, we always use method post for forms, okay? Post. And the difference will be obvious. When it's post, the form fields will go in the body of the request instead of the URL. That way, the server will not be able to log any of that information. So once you got that down, let's go back and test. Go back here and refresh because I changed the code. And I want to make another submission, me@mail.com. My password, sign in. I make sure the network tab is open. And now if you click that and you observe the request URL under the headers tab, I don't see that email and password anymore. That's because it's a post request, post method. When it's post, what happens is that information is included in the body of the request. And that's usually, if you go to the DevTools, you click payload, that's where it is now. And you click view the source, it's the same encoded, right? Same format and pattern. But it's now in a different place. And that place, the loggers on the server side will not be able to record that. Okay, they don't record that stuff. Okay. Now to wrap up, how about we talk about validations? Because you might notice, okay, sometimes the user might type something that we don't expect or don't accept. Okay. I must say though that validation must be enforced on the server side. So that means the person in charge of the backend server should make sure that they always validate the information that's received, because we can never guarantee that what information that's sent or received by them is accurate or is legit or is in the correct format. Okay, so that's why we can never trust front end or the website side information being submitted. Although I'm gonna show you how you can validate on the front end, that should not be your first line of defense. You should always make sure there's validation on the server side at least. And then if you want to be fancier and make your users have a better user experience, UX, you can add some front-end validations for feedback there. Okay, so let's do front-end validations here. You notice if I don't type an email and password, it submits, and that's not good. We want to require a password and an email, right? So how do we do that? Well, it's very easy. Go back to the code, locate the fields you want to be marked as required. So we want the email one, that's the input, add an attribute called required, and that's it. Simply say required. And this is a special attribute that doesn't need an explicit value, right? You can just type the name of the attribute and it will be marked as a required input. So the user has to type at least one character. Same thing for password. You can mark that as required by adding an attribute required. And all this is leveraging what we call HTML5 built-in validation, okay? So now save that, go back to the browser. If I refresh to bring up the new code, I click sign in, look what happens. It tells me, please fill out this field and marks email there. Okay, let me type ABC. Oh, it's still saying, please include at. ABC is missing at. So if I click sign in, it's always complaining about the email format. And that's why I put input typed email instead of type text. Because if I just had type text, I could type ABC and it would be accepted as email. But if I have the input type email, it will automatically validate and ask, hey, you need an at sign. Okay, at, it's still bad. So, okay, me.com. Okay, now it's an email format pattern. Okay, let's type the password. I'm going to leave it blank, click sign in, and tell me, please fill out this field. That's very powerful. Validations built in from the browsers. Okay, I'm going to type my password. And finally, it will let me go through. Okay, so that's front-end validation. And there are other attributes that you can look up later. Like for example, how many characters do you want to require at least for the password? Maybe at least 6 characters. Maybe you have a text field like you're commenting on a video, YouTube video, right? Maybe you cannot type so many characters. Maybe you're on like the Twitter X and they used to allow what certain number of characters. You cannot go over that. So you can add a validation for that using HTML attributes. Okay. So I don't have time to talk about that, but you can always look it up. How do I enforce validate for length of an input? Or you can ask your ChatGPT or whatever fancy AI tool you have today. For example, how to limit input field HTML, enter, and have some resources here. I really like the W3 Schools resource, and it just points me to the right thing. Okay, it tells me about the input attribute. Oh, max length. Okay, let me read this. So I can try for myself. Left-hand side is the code that you can change, and the right-hand side is what is corresponding to the code if you click run. And you can see here the input has an attribute max length 10. Okay, if I put max length 3 and click run, what happens? Let's type username A, B, C, D. It doesn't let me type D because the max length is just 3 characters. So that's very nice. Okay, and I think there's also minimum length and all this kind of stuff. So you can look it up and find out. Like I said, I think I put this as a resource for you to look up this W3 Schools, to go over the tutorial by yourself, to go over the exercises. You can learn more about these other kind of tags and attributes, because obviously there's so many of them, we cannot possibly go over all of them. Most of them, we barely use them. So I just try to teach you the most popular ones that are used. And again, I want to reiterate that if you need to learn how somebody else's website was built, you can always see the code, right? What if I want to go here? How did they build this green button? I think it's pretty. I can just right click that in the browser, click inspect, and I will understand how they built that button. Oh, they use an anchor tag. It's actually a link. They just built an anchor tag with these attributes. And on the right-hand side is the styling. As we learned later, is the CSS, cascading style sheets, that you can actually change it here like that. So you can see real time. That's just a sneak peek of CSS, which will be the next lecture. All right. And with that, I finished this lecture.